One of the things that's really difficult about today and a sticking point for us is that we get stuck on this idea that to be masculine means to not be feminine. And I would say most women's frustrations with men have to do with not because they're acting too effeminate. It's not that men don't know how to be men. It's that they're acting too much like boys.
You're back.
We're back.
What are we drinking today?
We've got Olipop Crisp Apple.
Crisp Apple. This is probably my new favorite Olipop flavor.
I would agree.
And
it's the second time being shown on this podcast.
The Crisp Apple?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yep.
But not only that, we are now officially partners of Olipop.
It's exciting.
So if you're listening to this, you can get yourself a 15% discount on your next order of Olipop if you basically click on the link below in the description. If you're on YouTube, Spotify, and get yourself some Crisp Apple Olipop.
Enjoy it.
Enjoy it. Enjoy it.
Savor it with us.
So, yeah, especially when it's cold.
Absolutely.
So, Del, I intentionally chose my dress code for today because of our topic.
Oh, boy.
I was like, what is the pinkest piece of clothing I can find? And I love that it's contrasted with your, like, flannel.
Nice.
Flannel shirt.
Yeah.
Because today's topic is basically modern masculinity. What does modern masculinity look like? And how is it embodied in today's culture, in today's era? How do we embody modern masculinity? This is, I feel like, a topic of discussion that we've spoken about quite a bit offline. And I feel like the conversation pretty much doesn't seem to end.
No.
At least between the two of us. I feel like it just there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think for good reason. You know, when thinking about all of this, it's one of those scenarios that you have such a deep, dense topic that hopefully the conversation doesn't end and just keeps going. Mm-hmm. So there's probably going to be more at some point that we're going to have to add to this, but hopefully we can provide a pretty good synopsis here. And to be quite honest, I like the topic. So what's some of your first takes on this modern masculinity? Where do we start with that?
Yeah, well, I think the starting point I think of is defining it.
Okay. Like,
what is masculine? What is it? What is masculinity? What are we talking about here?
Yeah.
Right? And we could take the quick dictionary definition.
Sure.
Which is pretty much like characteristics typically assigned to the biological male, and in terms of attributes that they naturally tend to exhibit, such as boldness, aggression. Or we could also take a look more historically, longitudinally, mm-hmm. Right? That's what the researchers say. Over time, what has masculinity meant across cultures, across time and generations? Mm-hmm. And the way I understand it is very simply the attributes that were ascribed to males throughout history. And the two ones I can think of is protector and provider. Hmm. A lot of things fall into that, but that's typically what I tend to hear across the board. Protector and provider. There's a video I sent to you a few weeks ago probably, and it was this like old African elder speaking about how the main purpose of a man in pre-colonial African nations, right, and kingdoms, was to protect the land. Like that's what they were understood their mission to be. Because if there's no land, then there's no place to live, there's no place to farm, there's no place to eat. And by protecting the land, they were able to protect their families and their lineage, which was also key, right? And they were able to provide as a result of protecting the land. So that's just one example that I just kind of think of when I look historically. How do you see it?
Well, no, I would agree with that. I think that from a basic starting point, we're just saying that, okay, it sounds like what we're getting into is saying, okay, we're talking about the basic biological factors that make it more accessible for a man to be masculine. Okay, so we're talking about testosterone, strength, perhaps endurance, right? Even you could argue aggression, right? Those propensities for violence. Because if we're talking from a biological perspective, again, it's like, okay, a protector had to be willing to do whatever it took to ensure the safety and security of his interests, right? I'm not trying to advocate volatility here, but we're just talking about those nature and natural inherent things that can exist. Yeah. Now,
that's a good point you brought up, because the strength, the aggression, the natural inclination to volatility, maybe violence, is what led to that protector label or protector assignment. So you feel like what you're describing sounds like the more basic characteristics of that biology.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. I would say similarly, right, we could see this, and again, to simplify, the very things that provide an attribute are also the things that provide a strength to that attribute. Right. And perhaps at times a weakness, right? Dependent on the given circumstance and culture. We wouldn't want men to perhaps be as volatile in today's standards through forms of violence because it's not as necessary. During points in time in history when there was less observation of moral law, right? Or less structure around law and governance, then you had a greater propensity to have bloodshed. Plain and simple. Now, I think one of the things that you brought up, though, is historically speaking, okay, in ancient cultures, what did it mean? And I think this brings up an important idea that we've talked about before on sidebars of what did it mean to the rest of the world for someone to become a man or to embody masculinity. I think one of the things that's really difficult about today and a sticking point for us is that we get stuck on this idea that, okay, well, to be masculine means, well, to not be feminine.
Yeah.
We get caught up, I think, especially in whether it's culture wars about, okay, well, this versus that. And it has nothing
that's the dichotomy we create.
Yes, we've created this large dichotomy, and I think that's happened out of a large source of insecurity. Because if we really knew where we stood, we don't have to focus so much on not being the other, but we can focus instead on how to grow from where we are. And what I mean by that is to say that masculinity is more about being able to let go of being a child or a boy and becoming a man.
That's a great distinction.
Right. It's not about not being a woman or acting like a woman or acting like a little girl. No, it's about not being a boy. I would say the greatest challenge that most men suffer from today is they don't know how to be a man, not because they're acting like a woman. No, it's because they're acting still like a child, like a boy. That transition has not taken place appropriately. And I would say most women's frustrations with men have to do with not because they're acting too effeminate. It's because they're acting too much like boys.
Yeah.
Right. It's not that men don't know how to be men. It's that they're acting too much like boys.
Ooh, that is a great distinction that I don't think we hear a lot of.
No.
Right?
Well, I think there's, again, I don't want to get off in the weeds into culture wars or anything like that, or of, we could talk about gender conflicts, but I think at the end of the day, the part that isn't brought up enough is, okay, look, 100 years ago, there wasn't a debate about whether or not someone is male or female. That was never discussed.
Right.
It was never brought up, well, he's exhibiting too many feminine characteristics. The problem was They didn't know how to move past the point from which they started.
And that's why we have rites of passage.
Beautiful.
In many cultures historically.
Yeah. So tell me about one we've talked about before.
Yeah.
Your culture.
Yeah. So I'm Kenyan. I was, born in Kenya, raised in East Africa. And one of the key milestones of my life was getting circumcised. So a lot of people now get circumcised when they're like babies, right? Just for health reasons. But my parents intentionally waited for myself and my younger brother till we were like 11. I think he was 7 at the time, pretty young, to get circumcised. And this is taking back to generations of a practice that my dad went through, my grandfather went through, where around at that age of 12, 13, your peers were taken through a process of circumcision, typically with very little pain medication, the procedure itself, in order to kind of symbolize your transition from boyhood into manhood. And so it was not something you just, went to the village doctor and he just did the procedure and you're done, which is really what it was like for me. So I think mine was just more of a cultural celebration versus like the actual meaning ascribed to it. And there was much more to the process that was involved, right? So you did it with peers, you did it with elders. It was other men with you who were there with you, supporting you through this. And as a result, my dad tells me that when he got circumcised, he was no longer allowed to live under the same roof as his parents. He's dude is like 12, 13. Firstborn son, right? Firstborn child. And so he lived on the same property. And of course, like still was, he was fed by them and things like that. But he was now required to live in a separate roofed structure, separate from his parents. Right? And you think about that and you're like, that's interesting. Like, why would they do that? That's kind of odd. Like he got the procedure, just like kind of, let's leave it at that. But actually that process of him being circumcised was not to pretty much be like, hey, can you endure this amount of pain? Maybe there was a part to that, but it was him entering a transformational journey. Him being placed now under his own separate roofing, now having to deal with experiences that maybe he had not experienced before. What does it mean to be alone at night by yourself? Parents are close, but you're by yourself. What does that mean? Right? Now you now start to see elements of your house. When you compare your house to your parents' house, you start to compare and contrast, and you're like, oh, okay, how come this house is all of a sudden getting dirty and theirs isn't? Right? Maybe I wouldn't have noticed that if I wasn't, that you start to see things that you otherwise wouldn't see. And so, there's some other rites of passage we've talked about, but there's something about the rite of passage that does something to the boy.
Yes.
And helps him transition into what we're now saying is the man.
Well, it sounds like what you're saying, based on what I'm hearing, is that essentially it wasn't this rite of passage, rather, had nothing to do with the benefit of your grandparents, right? Or your great grandparents. Like, it's not about the parents that it's actually benefiting.
No.
Though perhaps vicariously we could argue that it could be. Mm-hmm. It's about this process actually benefiting the individual because it shows them who they are and what they can be and what they're capable of, right? Now, it's interesting too, because you brought up the walkabout and I want to talk about that. But before we do, there's the other rite of passage that we've talked briefly about with Maasai culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Maasai culture, so that's also, again, Kenyan culture. They're like, Maasai are like our tribal mascots in Kenya. They're the ones who jump
fantastic.
high. Yeah.
Tribal
like,
mascots.
Yeah, it's like, this is the mascot of Kenya is the Maasai. Everyone thinks they're cool and Like, why are they so cool? They have all the coolest names and everything. And so they live close to the national safari parks. You know, for hundreds of years, they've lived alongside predators like lions and things like that. And Maasai actually also have the circumcision procedure without pain meds. And they also were known for requiring a boy to be able to kill a lion. Mm. So there's a video on YouTube. If you just search Maasai taking food from lion on YouTube, you can see Maasai men literally walking up to a pride of lions rather. And they just take the meat. The lions run away. And so the lions in the park are aware of these Maasai men, and they stay away from them, so much so that if you go to a hotel, like a safari hotel in Kenya or Tanzania, for example, you'll find that the people who protect the perimeter are the Maasai. It's not the electric fence, because they want to give you the safari experience. They're not trying to fence you away from wilderness. But the Maasai are there protecting you at night. And the predators know to stay away from these men. And it's like, I don't know if I'd be willing to go through that particular rite of passage. But just to give you a example of what some boys are taken through to get to manhood.
That's incredible. Yeah, no, I think that's a really important distinction, though, because, again, that's illustrating an idea. If me as a 13-year-old child am required to go face death, like quite literally that's what's happening, yeah. Right? I'm required to go face uncertainty. But it's interesting, though, because that requirement would also seem to implicate that there's an awareness of your capability. If all the Maasai knew that they were going to feed their child to a lion,
it would be extremely foolish.
Yeah, they wouldn't be requiring their kids to do it.
Yeah.
Like, if it just ended in that way all the time,
yeah,
right, this wouldn't happen. They don't do it for a 5-year-old, right?
Yeah.
That process doesn't take place at that time. Mm-hmm. There's a certain level of capability that's seen and understood that says, now it's time.
There's, belief.
There's belief.
That is ascribed to one's capacities.
Yes. Yeah. And that's a very powerful thing, I think. Now, to transitions perhaps to the other cultures of, walkabout, like Australian Aboriginal culture, very similar. So, boy, when he reaches a coming of age, essentially, he's supposed to go essentially fend for himself for a period of time. He's to go out to the wilderness and completely fend for himself, away from anyone else. He's supposed to be by himself. He's supposed to encounter whatever he's going to encounter independently, autonomously. That's a powerful experience.
Yeah.
Because if I can do that, and if I'm aware of that, I'm aware of what I am not capable of, and I'm aware of what I'm capable of. Quite literally, I'm coming to the place of shedding skin, in effect. You know, to quote some biblical perspective, when I was a child, I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. Mm. When I became a man, I put away childish things. And I don't want this to sound perhaps too overdone, but there's a lot of relevance to that in terms of these experiences, I think.
Mm-hmm. What do you think are some of the common denominators, like when we look at some of these different rites of passage? Like, one is, I see it is challenge. There's some sort of challenge that is placed on the individual.
Yes. No, I would say that the common denominators are that they are all, well, I think challenge is a great point, but I think that they're all challenging within specific environments.
Okay.
Right? Mm-hmm. We've talked about perhaps these elements before, and I think these elements will come back to tie in later, but I think that they challenge the individual, we could say arguably within 5 spheres. They challenge them physically, mentally, emotionally, relationally, and spiritually. Mm. Mm. Right? They provide a total new, separate type of challenge within those spheres. right? Physically, just because of the physical demands for the individual to say, okay, it is me. Like, it's not getting done unless I do.
Yeah, no one's going to do it for me.
Yes, right?
I must go through this experience.
Exactly. Mentally, because it takes a certain amount of mental fortitude to be able to then reinforce that physical notion.
That the only way out is through.
Yes. Emotionally, because you're going to experience all types of anger, resentment, perhaps wondering why, a variety of things. Fear. Discomfort. Right? Uncertainty. Those emotions are not the same as the decision to do something, right? The emotions come on impulse. So it's now is the challenge of regulating your own brain and mind to survive, right? Relationally, you're alone. It is you, right? Or perhaps within certain contexts,
so for example, like my dad's situation, certain aspects of it, there's a sense of aloneness, solitude and aloneness. Certain aspects of it was you're with elders and peers, and you're in a very unique, like you're away from your caregivers. You're not typically with your parents. These were specific elders assigned to help you through this. Is that what were you going to say? Yeah.
No, I would say that. But then also where the relational comes into respect is that understanding that my journey is my own. I must take responsibility for how I endure on this path. Right? It is my own, independent of what others around me may or may not do. And then the last one, spiritually, right? Obviously, that's something that inside of this context, like ultimately there's an underpinning of some Judeo-Christian values, but I would say whether or not we're adopting those or even others across cultures, there's an element of the spiritual of, okay, what does it mean to be in existence as a man? And how does that look as it relates to how I view myself in relationship to the divine? Right? Or how am I embodying that? Because that would then say, I would argue, would encompass all the rest of them. Right? So this is where I would say that the spiritual could also be contrived as, or rather described as, how do I believe I am pursuing all these previous four?
What guides all these?
Yes. Right.
What's the foundation? And
the foundation, so another way to describe the spiritual would be to say, how well do I feel I'm living according to my own values? Right. And I would say that definition would cross cultural or religious divides. Like no matter what your religious affiliation is, how well do I feel I'm living according to these previous four? But that question is very much, I would say, a spiritual question. And it's pursued from the bent of a spiritual bend.
Yeah. Wow.
I would say that's how that challenges.
Yeah.
Right?
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah, that's good. There's a C.S. Lewis, in case some of you have not noticed the trend. We love to quote C.S. Lewis. And I'm trying to remember where this is from particularly. And he speaks about this boy, man-child. What is it? What's the term? Boy-child? Man-child?
In which book?
Like, well, just
or in the
just
concept.
Saying culturally, yeah.
Okay,
there's this concept of like a man is still a boy, right?
Sure.
Like these men walking around as boys, right? And so he basically talks about how often men often fail at embodying the traits that we're talking about.
Sure.
And he says, we men may often make very bad priests. That is because we are insufficiently masculine. It is no cure to call in those who are not masculine at all. A given man may make a very bad husband. you cannot mend matters by trying to reverse the roles. He may make a bad male partner in a dance. The cure for that is that men should more diligently attend dancing classes, not that the ballroom should henceforward ignore distinctions of sex and treat all dancers as neuter.
He hit it.
Not good?
He hit it.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's like, that's the challenge, right? It's going from boyhood to manhood.
I would agree. Mm-hmm. And I think the important thing, because I think what the struggle is for many is that there is an identification of personal insufficiencies, right? That we may find in ourselves that we're like, well, how do we address these? What am I supposed to do with this? And so then it can be oftentimes easy to feel defeated as a result of those things, as a result of those things that we identify, instead of leaning in to accept that, no, the natural course of action is, okay, maybe I just take dance classes. That's okay. It doesn't mean that I'm less than, because I think what's easy for people to do, I don't think we're all that complex, actually. I think sometimes we like to make it way more complicated than it needs to be. In terms of, we say, well, how is it that I'm supposed to be more manly? How can I be more assertive or be more confident? Right. Confidence is the one you hear all the time. It's like, I just want to be more confident. Yeah. Right. Yeah. In reality, I think how that takes place is actually way more simple than we make it out to be. We accept that there's certain specific areas that we identify a lack of competency. When we accept that, now we can start to grow within those areas. Right. Once we start to grow within those areas, or we accept that, you know what? Yeah, that's an area that I'm not confident in. Is that okay? Do I have to be? So I would argue that the first premise is being able to own that, and then simply do something about that in a very pragmatic way, actually. Many, I would argue, experience this towards their physical posture and stature. Like, okay, well, I'm not built like Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? Because there's this idea or model around what is the masculine.
Right, like the Greek
god
of Mars.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. However, I don't think that that's actually the answer. I think that, it's much more simple. I think many men would experience more confidence in themselves, and I think that many do, when they recognize that they don't have to look a certain way in order to feel confidently about how their body operates. I would attribute this, I'm going to use a perfectly pragmatic example. Full disclosure, I felt extremely insecure about my body, right? And I don't look terrible, right? I don't look bad. I know this. But I still felt a lack of confidence around myself and my body until I realized what my body was capable of. The thing that showed me that the most, in a pragmatic way, was jiu-jitsu. Which is a buzzword across so many podcasts now.
Right.
Like, okay, shout out to Jocko. Like he probably put it out there the most and talks about it the most, but for a reason.
Yeah, there's a reason why.
And I think boys especially are predispositioned to be able to experience that in a very real way. I think there's a reason inherently why boys typically are more physical, even biologically growing up. Right? They often walk, run, crawl sooner than their female counterparts. Right? That's going to exist. I think that in and of itself points to a very important piece that exists for boys to be able to enter that transitional period of becoming a man. I think that's also what cultures understood for centuries, in that, no, they need to be able to see this in themselves. They need to go kill the lion themselves. They need to be able to go on walkabout themselves.
That's good. Yeah. So that's themselves. They need to do it themselves. And I think that is key, because when you don't do it yourself, there is a implicit communication that if this guy is not going to do it, maybe he doesn't know how to do it. Maybe he's inadequate. Maybe he doesn't have the potential. And I say that even from personal experience. When I was growing up, I had friends who learned to drive super early. 13-year-olds, 15-year-olds, of course, within safe, monitored environments. I learned to drive kind of late, even after the legal age. And it probably wasn't the intention of my parents for that situation. They did want to, make sure I was protected, doing the right thing. But unconsciously, and I've spoken to this with a few friends who in other areas of life, maybe they feel kind of behind in certain accomplishments and milestones. They almost have this sense of inadequacy, because it's oh, so is it that maybe no one thought I was capable of doing it? Maybe I actually can do it. And so it's internalized, and it almost applies in other areas too. Is there's something inherently inadequate about myself, and there's not much that can be done about that. And I think what you're trying to get at here is that not only were these rites of passage meant to help you do it by yourself, but also be okay with the inadequacy, and knowing that in knowing your inadequacy, you can now start to work on improving yourself. And it's okay to own your inadequacies. It's okay to own your lack of competence.
I would suggest there's a reason that Messiah were required to kill a lion and not a bull elephant. That task is completely inordinate, right? A lion is still challenging, still arguably accessible, still dangerous enough. An elephant by yourself is stupid.
Yeah.
And it's not to say, I want to be really careful too. It's not to say that women don't experience these same things. But I think what we're talking about is how these things relate to men and the uniqueness of men and being a man.
Yeah.
Right. And how those things take place.
Yeah. And it's interesting because also when, I think it's Jason Wilson, he speaks a lot on manhood as well. He has a great book called, I think, The Man for the Moment or something like that. One of the things he talks about when coaching men and women is that men fear being vulnerable because they fear being seen as weak, or in other words, inadequate.
Sure.
Right? The contrast of that is often women don't tend to have that same, maybe they do, but not to the same extent. Of I'm okay talking about the things I'm struggling with, the things I have challenges with, the areas I'm struggling, I need help. It's oh yeah, your spouse will just, go ahead and tell you that. But you as a man, there's something, that you fear to expose that part of yourself. Right? And so I don't know if there's differences there, but it seems to be an observed trend.
I think it would be interesting to compare it. Perhaps we could look at it from a perspective, say, of historical roles. And you could argue that there's some epigenetic factors to how those things developed through time historically. And when I say historically, I mean hundreds of years, right? For women to have a strength or a greater ability to be able to disclose, I think part of that could be predicated on the notion that, okay, they also have to instill that in their children, because children need to be able to ask for help inherently. And if the woman, historically speaking, was a caretaker, it was her job to instill those values. No better way to instill those values than by modeling them. However, then the obvious challenge is the masculine. That's not going to be a role that's taken place as easily. But then as time shifts, that feminine trait, I would argue, can withstand the social pressure of time and actually ages better than the one of reservation and not showing my cards. That ages poorly and doesn't actually help me. I really like this quote by David Gilmour. Manhood is the defeat of childhood narcissism.
Ooh.
If we take that apart one piece at a time,
Yeah.
to imply that there's narcissism within childhood also implies that it's very difficult for some level of self-awareness and then thinking that things are all about me. So in essence, we could argue that if a man is struggling still with not being vulnerable out of fear of vulnerability, there is still an element of that childhood narcissism that exists.
That fear of vulnerability.
Yes.
Is because it's still self-centered?
Well, because I would argue that true narcissism would suggest that I don't have problems. There's a lack of awareness to be able to see myself. And perhaps it's predicated on the fear that I couldn't tolerate or bear to see implicit challenges in myself.
Right.
And so to say manhood is the defeat of childhood narcissism is also very deep, because not only is it talking about, okay, moving from a boy to a man, but it's talking about the psychological shift, I believe, of, okay, what does it mean to be someone that holds myself at such a standard, but not too high that I can't see my own flaws, and how I can be able to see them all clearly and still accept my competency and my ability to grow at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at some point, like even you, at times you, the very fact that we at times may get disappointed at not meeting a standard is proof that we have the standard, right? And this kind of relates to toxic masculinity. You know, a lot of people are talking about toxic masculinity. And this discussion has helped me kind of gain a better understanding of that, because I feel like what people are really talking about is, in many ways, the boyhood that's coming into the masculine. So the example that I can think of immediately from what you just shared is the complaint that men are like emotionally unavailable or emotionally suppress. The key, probably the most obvious one, is they don't disclose. They're not able to admit their weaknesses and their vulnerabilities to an intimate partner, to maybe others in a job, corporate setting, and have to protect and assert that image of know-it-all. I can do it. No issues, no problems. And then that causes harm and issues along the way.
Yeah, and I would argue that's not actually toxic masculinity, because that's not masculine in the first place. I would argue that there's still a holding of childhood narcissism there.
Yeah.
There is still insecurity that exists there. And if we're constituting narcissism originating from a source of insecurity, right, then we're saying that insecurity still exists. And I think it's a really profound point, because if we think about children, for example, how often, like if we see children compete in children games, right? How often do you see a little boy or girl, for that matter, that doesn't want to play a game because they've never played it before, and they're scared of how they would look playing the game if they weren't good at it? Or they make up certain reasons to why they couldn't do this, because they didn't have the right shoes or the right shirt. And we look at them with compassion to say, oh, it's okay. We know what it's like to be a child. They don't feel very good about this. But in reality, they are attempting to preserve their image. Because what would they be if they're not good at this thing that other people are good at? Seemingly. But what that is, I would argue, especially for young boys, is a certain element of childhood narcissism, as we're defining it here and now.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And as it pertains to, okay, steering back to this, what you brought up here, toxic masculinity. First of all, I don't believe in toxic masculinity. I don't believe it's a thing. I don't believe it's real. I believe in toxic people.
Mm. And toxic people.
And toxic people. I believe that people can be toxic and have toxic traits.
Yes.
Men and women alike.
Mm. So then...
And by the way, I have to give full credence to that because a close friend of mine, Jason Foster, was one of the first people that I had conversations with this about. So I need to say that for full disclosure.
All right.
But I think the elements of this idea, and I'm sure that he is not the first, nor myself, to articulate this, but I think it's important to say because it's relevant, right? I think the truth of this statement is to say that, okay, people alike are capable of terrible things.
Yes.
And so to say that there are only certain things, specifically, only a man does this, or only a woman does this, it's a very myopic idea. Like, it's almost as if, like, we could argue that it's very sexist, actually.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The term toxic masculinity, because we're saying that only a man does this thing, or these attributes are only attributed to men.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. So could you then argue that the same with masculine in general without the toxic, take away the toxic part, right?
To say that only men are masculine?
Yeah.
We could say that, but it wouldn't be true.
Right. Mm.
Right? Mm. Women can exhibit masculine traits. Mm. The difference, I would argue, is that they're just not as good at it inherently. Just as a man is not going to be as good inherently, and I'm talking about inherent basis, based on how they are biologically wired. Mm-hmm. 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 They will not, like from the get-go, from day one, from the time that you are born, what your natural inclinations may be. Now, we're also coming from this presupposition that, okay, for instance, like towards language, we know biologically girls talk sooner than boys. We know biologically boys are going to be more active physically, typically.
Yes.
Now, it's not to say we can't alter those things. Let's say you just talked with a boy and you didn't encourage him to crawl, walk, or any of those things, right? Even with that, historically speaking, we know that there are some differences, especially in neurodevelopment, right? We can see that women's prefrontal cortex develop at a faster rate than men's. Women also mature at a quicker rate than men do. So inherently, there is going to come certain strengths with that. With that in mind.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So to say now, all right, yeah, sure. Women can exhibit masculine traits.
Yes.
Men can exhibit feminine traits.
Yes.
But again, as we said from the beginning, masculinity is not about proving that we are not feminine or have feminine traits. Mm-hmm. Masculinity is about showing that I'm no longer a boy.
Yeah.
But I have become a man.
Yeah. So the funny thing is that most people, when they talk about toxic masculinity, right, they talk about, so I'll put it this way. This is how like Jason Wilson describes to it.
Yeah.
He's like, masculinity itself is not toxic, but becomes so when a man allows his humanity to only be defined by masculinity.
I would agree with that.
You would agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because now we're talking about I am only these things, and if I don't exhibit these things to the fullest degree, right, I am incomplete somehow. I think what that's saying,
and that I cannot embody anything outside of the masculine.
Yes. Yes, because
right, because it's like no, I am versus
it's rigid.
Masculinity versus femininity.
It's rigid.
Yeah,
it's too rigid.
Mm-hmm.
Because ultimately, it's not true.
Yeah,
you're a human being first, right?
Yes.
Now, with that though, I think that the important distinction is to say that, okay, if I say I can only be these things, I think the other reason that gets dangerous is because now and this is where we're going to kind of, I think, touch on another point. If I say I can only be these things, these masculine features, I'm essentially placing goals on these masculine features. I must be, I must exhibit authority, or I must be authoritative, or authoritarian.
Yes.
And we attempt to complete this as if it's a goal, instead of recognizing that I can have authority and I can pursue being someone who deserves authority as a value, being a responsible individual. But if my goal is to be an authority, now I am making a goal out of a value which inherently does not work. And it's not meant to work.
Yeah. It falls on its face.
It falls on its face because inherently a value like being courageous, being honorable, being fair, being just, those can never be achieved. They have to be pursued always, because you have to accept that you will never be fully encompassed in any of those areas. There's always more that you can learn. So therefore, you will never achieve them because they're not meant to be achieved.
Yeah.
They're meant to be pursued. But I think that brings us to this other area, this other notion, I think, that's circling within and has been used to define masculinity. And that's that, okay, I must gain value as a man.
High value man.
Yes.
Yeah. I must be a high value man.
Because I am inherently entering the world as unvaluable.
Yeah, this idea that men must earn their value and women inherently have value, but men don't. That's an idea that you hear quite a bit.
I think to illustrate some of these points, even of what we've said about walkabouts and rites of passage, we've already illustrated the idea that it was never the intention, based on what can be observed, for men to earn their value, because we've already illustrated that it wasn't the man's job to kill the lion to keep the tribe safe. The tribe was already safe. They had plenty of men that could kill lions. The idea was that the boy killed a lion so that he can see his value, because it already existed.
So important. That's such an important distinction. Because one would automatically go to, oh, I must prove myself. I must earn. They're depending on me to do this. But it's like, no, that's not what it was about. It was for him to see his value. Then he would be dependent on it at a later point.
Yes. Because, yes, don't get me wrong. There will come a time in which people are depending on you. Right? In which there is responsibility that you have, that you are called upon. But the way that you achieve that is by understanding that those are pursuits and not objects. And hearkening back to reiterate this notion, the idea that men inherently don't have any value, I believe, is a flawed idea. Only because I don't think it supports what can be seen in basic history. And I don't believe that it supports a helpful longitudinal idea for masculinity in general. Because it also would suggest then that women are inherently valuable, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that actually does a bit of disservice, because now we're saying that, okay, inherently women have something, they automatically have a leg up for a specific reason. I don't think that's true. I don't think men have a leg up for a specific reason. I don't think that women do. Now, if we're talking about, okay, who's more capable of certain things, right? Obviously, historically speaking, biologically speaking, men had a greater disposition to be a protector because from a, say, a biological perspective, their muscles were going to develop. They could kill the lion, right? You needed a certain amount of strength or speed. Mm-hmm. You couldn't nurse children.
Yeah, right. It was just easier for the man to do it.
Yes. Yeah. It was a pragmatic detail that was solved. Mm-hmm. The woman was much better at taking care of the child and ensuring the safety of the family on the other front.
Yeah.
Right? Because they still had to do it as well. It just looked different. Mm-hmm. Now, arguably, this is where, and this is why I would argue that, okay, if I see myself as someone who has to achieve value, I believe it's much easier to get lost in this never-ending rat race of will I be enough once I have gotten A, B, C, or D, and constantly waiting until I get the car, until I get the job, until I get the promotion, until I'm accepted by these people, until I have everything that I need to be just a certain way. And that is the biggest lie that we tell ourselves, is that I must have more.
In order to be
somehow satisfied, or in order to be somehow complete, in order for me to give myself the ability to feel okay.
Yeah.
It's the biggest lie. Because the truth is that I need none of those things. The truth is that life and meaning and purpose and value are quests that we pursue daily, regardless of what we have.
Yeah, we're free to pursue them, regardless of what we have. Yeah.
And they are never ending.
That's good. Yeah, it's going back to the high value discussion. A lot of it is predicated, especially in discussions on the internet, around achieving value so that you can become desirable. Desirable by who? Most likely desirable by other women. Because a lot of single men, it's appealing to a lot of single men who maybe have not had success in relationships. There's the concept of the incel, involuntary celibate, right? And so it's like, how do I eventually get to a place where I can get the woman of my dreams, the woman that I want to be with? And so you see these other quote unquote high value men on the internet, and they're like, okay, they've got the car, they've achieved success, they've done all these things to make them desirable and feel like they have more choice, autonomy, and freedom to choose and have options and to move things in their sphere and in the world, right? And so it's appealing to a lot of young men because it seems empowering. It seems like a solution to one's helplessness or like one's feeling of insecurity and inadequacy to pursue these goals, right? And some would say that, isn't it helpful to want to self-improve, because self-improvement is a big thing and part of these ideas, right? Self-improvement. But I would argue that self-improvement is great, but self-improvement does not encompass all of that. Like we can separate self-improvement from these other ideas of saying that I must be all of these things in order to be complete, in order to be enough, right? In order to be desirable, which I guess maybe to play devil's advocate for a little bit. But what if a lot of people are like, I am not desirable as I stand. So what if I need to do stuff to be desirable as a man, especially to maybe a woman that I desire to be with?
Sure.
That I consider a woman of character, a beautiful woman, a woman who can be a wife and a mother, but I feel like I lack the things for that woman to desire me. Isn't there merit in me pursuing some of these things that they're talking about so I can be capable?
So I think there's merit, but very little. right? Because at the end of the day, again, we're talking about increasing our value for the sake of someone else.
That's the
key factor.
That's the key factor there.
Right? I believe that the key problem with saying that I will increase my value is that we're missing the point about where my value is. Value inherently, if we were looking at this from even a business perspective, also is predicated on the notion of potential value, right? Especially if I'm dealing with, like, if I buy a piece of property that is prime real estate, right? Yeah, it doesn't have stores on it yet, right?
Just a flat piece of land.
It's just a flat piece of land, but it's in a prime area for growth, right? And largely, value is predicated based on the eye of the beholder, right? So if I say now that I'm only valuable if I can do these things or I'm able to get these pieces, well, that's inherently untrue. My capability is much higher. So the shame in it is not that I don't have those things. The shame in it is that I don't see my own capability. Yeah. And I'm not taking advantage of that. That is the shame in it. Right? If men want to feel bad because, well, yeah, I could be better, I could do better, then do it. The shame in all of this is not that they haven't done it yet. The shame in this is that they don't actually see it, because if they did, they would go and do it.
Right.
I would say the problem for most men is that they don't actually see their own true capability, which also is true in both negative and positive. They don't see their own capability to really screw things up.
That is for sure. Definitely see that in the counseling room.
100%. How did I get here?
How did I get here? How could I make such a big mistake?
Right. Yeah. But here we are. But the reality is that's true for the positive. See your own capability. Right?
Yeah.
I think that's a really important distinction in terms of saying being high value versus pursuing high values.
Ooh. Being high value versus pursuing high values.
Yes.
And that has a profound impact, I think, on relationships. Because I think when you pursue a relationship from a place of wanting to be high value, again, you're placing the onus on the other person to decide whether you're valuable or not. So, okay,
exactly.
Let's just say you get married. So it's like, oh, I guess I'm valuable, right? But then now what it means is that you've still put the onus on them to basically
inform you on your worth.
Inform you on your worth, which means that now you're performing and you're performative. And there's certain other values that you may put to the side, like honesty, right? Integrity, right? And now you're hiding stuff. There's like double, and then we go back to the areas of feeling afraid to be vulnerable and admit your weaknesses, because if I admit my weakness, then I will no longer be the high value person that I showed myself to be to this person. Instead of simply pursuing the high values independent of this person's acceptability of your value, right? And therefore, you actually end up providing more value to that person because now you fully invest in that relationship. And so high values, pursuing high values versus being high value, there's a big difference there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you brought up a really great point, because the question you asked earlier was, isn't there value? Isn't there merit to say, okay, well, I just want to get in shape, or I just want to do, well, sure, I'd say there's merit. It's like evaluating a drug. Alcohol is a really functional drug for decreasing anxiety. Yeah. It works really well, right? I'll say anything.
Yeah.
It's just not very sustainable.
Not at all.
Somewhere it falls apart.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Typically in the morning.
Yeah. Typically in the morning. So yes, there's value in getting in shape, being your best self, but it's not what makes you valuable. The value will never actually be attained. and should never be attained if it's truly valuable. I would then ask the next question. Sorry, you were.
Yeah. Oh, no. I was just going to say, which is like, it's an interesting paradox too, because it's like, from the Judeo-Christian perspective, one is inherently valuable, right? As ascribed by the divine, by God. But also that value, it cannot be computed. It cannot be, there's no static point to it either. Right? So it's like that idea of like value that can never be measured.
Exactly. Now, to further play advocate to this point, or perhaps even devil's advocate to the point of, okay, being high value. If that idea works, how would we know it works? Right? What would be the metric based on how we evaluate whether or not this idea of living works really well?
Yeah, good question.
Well, how would we know? Typically, what we would do is we would look at a sample size of people that decide to live this way, or that perhaps profess this way of living. And we say, okay, one, do they do what they profess? Is it providing them satisfaction? Are they able to do the things that seem valuable and important to us? Do they have a family? Do they have a spouse? Meaningful relationship? Career that's valuable and meaningful? Are they able to pursue a purpose-driven life? Because if that's what we want, and they're not able to do that,
and embody that
based on what they're saying as a philosophical framework, because make no mistake, that's what this is. Being a high value man, quote unquote, is a philosophical framework to approach the world.
Yeah.
So if we see it in any other form than that, we're misguided. But that's what this is. So if we're going to evaluate that from a philosophical framework, we should then be able to see at some point fruits of its labor.
Yeah. Where are the results?
Yeah. Okay.
Works.
And so I would argue then that we've seen plenty of people, and in our fields specifically, how many people do you know that are so successful and void? Success given that, okay, have millions of dollars, have a 10 out of 10 spouse. Right.
Have the job,
have the car. Why am I still so sad? Why do I still not like myself? What is the problem? And I would argue the problem is that we started from a fundamentally flawed predisposition. And it's an interesting idea because for whatever reasons, some may say, well, it's not a problem if yeah, sure, maybe some of these people that ascribe these certain ideas, maybe they don't live how we want to live, but they're still good ideas. What's interesting about that, though, is that we would typically define that as hypocritical. It's interesting, though, that in certain contexts, hypocrisy really bothers us. In others, it doesn't. As long as it's dressed up really nicely. Let's say in religion, most people's qualm with religion and organized religion is, well, there's too many hypocrites.
Yeah, right. Too many. Don't do what they profess.
Yeah. So I can't possibly take anything they say as a good idea. Which, okay, fair enough. However, if we're going to hold that measure, then we ought to hold the same measure
across the board.
Now, the one difference here, I would argue from, say, a Judeo-Christian perspective, is that even people in religion, they may say those things, but those are only reverberations. They weren't the first to say them. They come from a long historical context of belief and philosophy. Just as the idea of being high value does. It didn't start with whoever's saying it now. Nothing under the sun is new. So I think that's a very important distinction to make and understand.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, especially when you're dealing with half-truths, it can be hard, right? Half-truths, because it's like there's something there that is good, But you got to look at the whole picture, man. Let's see. Let's look at the results. Look at the fruits of that to see what is it actually beneficial to the life you are trying to live, the type of person you're trying to embody.
To steer it back, okay, we're on this notion of, all right, well, what does it mean to be a man, or rather embody masculinity? Because I think that's really the big question.
Yeah.
Is what does it mean to embody masculinity in today's day and age? And I think to sum it up and to recap, really what this means is we're talking about it means not being feminine or feminine. No. What this means is we understood the idea and what it means to see ourselves as capable, moving from a boy to a man. Mm-hmm. To see ourselves as that for our own beneficence, right? So that we can see the proverbial lion and what we are capable of. Additionally, I think that this also points to our ability to live out values. Mm-hmm. Our ability to put aside that childhood narcissism. Our ability to accept challenge within those 5 areas that we talked about. The physical, the mental, emotional, relational, the spiritual. Can we accept challenge in those areas? Can we challenge ourselves?
Right. Which to me, I just envision being stretched.
Yes.
Right.
It's interesting because I think other people have read this poem before.
Yeah.
And one of those, okay, again, I already gave a shout out to him earlier, but Jocko Willink read this poem. He has this thing floating around on YouTube, and it's if you haven't seen it, he does a really good job. It's very music, very theatrical, and it's fantastic.
Yeah.
But I think the message is very important. It's If by Rudyard Kipling. And so I'm going to read it now.
Yeah.
Because I think it's important to really understand the weight of this.
And I think the context of that is he was writing it like as if reading to a son or something.
This is correct.
Yeah. Okay.
And yes, you and I have talked about this before. I believe you even had brought up that you were looking at some history of this, and he was
inspired
yes.
by like a general, British general who was getting a lot of flack publicly for failing at a specific mission. Military mission.
Conquest, yeah.
And I think that's what inspired his poem. Yeah. You also have it on your wall.
I do have it on my wall as well. So I'm going to read it now. So this is If by Rudyard Kipling. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, but make allowance for their doubting too. If you can wait and not be tired of waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies. Or being hated, don't give way to hating. And yet don't look too good, nor talk too wise. If you can dream and not make dreams your master. If you can think and not make thoughts your aim. If you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same. If you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken, and stoop and build him up with worn-out tools. If you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss, and lose and start again at your beginnings, and never breathe a word about your loss. If you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they're gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you except the will which says to them, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings, nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run. Yours is the earth and everything in it. And which is more, you'll be a man, my son. This entire poem is a paradox of ideals. Or rather, I should say a paradox between emotion and ideals. Right?
Paradox.
It's discussing the fact that, okay, this never ends. This is something that is constantly pursued, right? If you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two imposters just the same. Because I would argue that the reason they're imposters is because you've never actually triumphed. And you've never actually failed. You only fail when you stop trying. But again, that's a pursuit. And so I think he understood this well. And I would say that the history of it also points to that.
Yeah. No, I love that paradox of qualities and ideas that he brings out in, of course, such a brilliant way. It reminds me of this definition that, again, going back to Jason Wilson, that he shares, that, we often try to say that a man should be this way, a man should be that way, right? Like a man should be courageous, or a man should be compassionate. But he brings the idea of comprehensiveness. A man should be comprehensive based on what the moment demands. He can be courageous. He can be compassionate. He can be strong. He can be sensitive. And you see that practically. Like, I see it, like, honestly, like, I see it in you oftentimes.
Gonna make me blush.
I know. That was my goal today, right? And I see it. And the reason why I just want to point you out as an example is because, like, I see you, for example, in the jiu-jitsu gym, coaching, and then also competing against others, right? And, you're choking someone out, right? And there's that level of strength and aggression that the moment demands, of course, like, because you're grappling, but then 30 minutes later, you're in the home, and if anyone knows, Dale is a girl dad of several girls.
This is true.
You can't be choking, you're not, you got to leave that at the gym, right?
Sure.
And now, maybe your kids are doing, acting up, trying to put the kids to bed, but then all of a sudden, like, you're gentle and you're speaking in a soft voice and, gently correcting them or gently comforting them if they're crying, and just being a father, right? Like, if you brought that same energy to your kids, like, what would that's not going to help these kids to develop into the kids they need to be and to meet their needs at that point, right? And so it's that comprehensiveness, is being able to adapt, per se, to the moments in order to be of service, in order to pursue these values that we're talking about. And yeah, it's so much more than just trying to, it's just the masculine, just the, not feminine, right? But there is that element of, we must graduate from boyhood, because life life is hard, man. Life will demand a lot out of you, and life will require different qualities at different times, different moments, and being willing to, one can fear back from that, but one can also be like, you know what, I'm gonna face it. I might not have the abilities now, but I'm gonna learn. I'm gonna try grow in these areas that we just talked about, so I can be the man the moment demands.
Thank you. That was extremely kind. It made me tear up a little bit.
Yeah, man. I mean, it's because the contrast is so clear, right? Like, girl dad, and then in the gym, like, it's a contrast,
Yeah. Well, I I think part of me, like mentally, I'm just preparing for the day that my girls bring home boyfriends. Like
Right.
everyone talks about like holding a rifle, like, you know, that whole like old school like
Yeah.
idea, like you're cleaning the rifle, making sure that the boy understands. It's like, no, I don't want to do that. I would rather my daughters just bring their date to the gym and that be
For a class.
yeah, just for a class. And there's a physical understanding of what happens.
Very controlled environment.
A very controlled environment. Nothing
crazy.
Nothing crazy. We're just doing jujitsu.
We'll just slap bump at the end
That's
and at
right.
the beginning.
It'll be fine.
It'll be good.
Of course, with my luck, they're gonna like date some like world champion.
Yes.
And that's what will happen.
Exactly.
And then my ego will be flattened again. That'll be okay. But
Yeah, so yeah, man.
But
I feel
that's-
like Kipling hit it.
He did.
With that, you know.
he did, I think, and that's a take on modern manhood.
Yeah. That's all I got.
That's all I got. Until next time.
Until next time.